Dawn rose slow that morning, as if the sun itself was hesitant to touch the world. Frost clung to the grass in silver threads, and the air held that thin, breakable stillness that comes just before a man discovers something that will alter his life forever. Calder Boone rode along the narrow gulch with the posture of a man who had been quiet too long, shoulders pulled inward, hat low, eyes drifting to places far older than the morning. Dust lifted in small clouds behind his horse's hooves, drifting like old memories refusing to settle. He saw the shapes before he understood them. 5 silhouettes hanging from the twisted arms of a cottonwood tree, hangings upside down, swaying slightly, as if the wind were trying to shake life back into them. Calder slowed, then halted. His breath left him in a single, unsteady exhale. At first he told himself they must be carcasses, coyote kills strung by some cruel trapper, or maybe outlaws making spectacle. But when the light shifted just enough to touch bare ankles, rope-burned wrists, braided hair swaying like dying leaves, Calder felt the cold slide deeper into his bones. They were girls, Apache girls, and they were still alive. The youngest foot twitched, a small, desperate motion. One of the others gave a weak groan, a sound so fragile it cracked open something inside him he thought had long turned to stone. Calder dismounted slowly, as though afraid the world might break further if he moved too fast. He stood there a long moment, just listening to their strangled breaths, to the ropes stretching under their weight, to the sound of his own memories rising like ghosts behind him. Years ago, he had not been fast enough. Years ago, it had been his own sister whose life slipped through his fingers like water he couldn't hold. He had promised himself he'd never again be pulled into someone else's tragedy. The world breaks what stands too close to it, he used to think. But this morning the world had decided not to offer him a choice. Behind him, hooves approached, light, uneven. Widow Marla Jessup reined her mare beside him, her face pale as bone. "I tried to talk Caro out of it," she whispered, her voice thin as river silt. "He said they were thieves. Said he was showing the town what happens to wild blood." Calder didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the girls. "You know they didn't steal nothing," Marla said, her voice trembling with shame. "Everyone knows." But nobody stood up to him. There it was, that quiet cruelty that towns often wore like a second skin. The kind that let injustice pass, so long as it meant their own lives stayed neat and undisturbed. Calder felt the anger come slow, like heat under cold metal. One of the girls, a teenager, maybe 16, twisted her head painfully to look at him. Her dark eyes met his. A spark of defiance flickered there, even upside down, even half-conscious. Naeli, though he didn't know her name yet. Calder's decision was made before he took his next breath. "Give me your knife," he said softly. Marla handed it over with shaking hands. He cut the first rope carefully, catching the girl as she fell, trying to spare her the shock of the landing. She hissed through clenched teeth, but did not cry out. Her hands were bound behind her, her ankles swollen and bruised from hours of pressure. Calder lowered her gently onto a blanket from his saddlebag, her breath shallow but steady. One by one, he freed the others. Tallulah flinched violently when his hands touched her shoulders, as though expecting more pain. Onassa, the smallest one, barely managed a whimper before collapsing against his chest, her skin cold as creek water. Kiona tried to sit up immediately, her pride fighting her body's weakness. Zena stayed silent, eyes staring at the sky as though afraid to come back into herself. Calder gave them his canteen, moving slowly, speaking little. Every gesture deliberate, careful. Words at a moment like this were just noise. What mattered was steadiness. Naeli, the oldest, watched him with guarded suspicion, but never looked away from him. "What Caro did," Marla whispered, holding her shawl tight around herself. "The town, they just watched." Calder didn't answer. He saw in her eyes the unbearable truth. She was here now, but too late. She was here to ease her conscience, not theirs. He dipped cloth in his spare water pouch and cleaned the girl's wrists. He tore strips from his own shirt to wrap their ankles. He worked with the quiet focus of a man repairing something he had no business fixing but could not leave broken. "They'll come for them," Marla said softly. "Dent won't let you take them." Calder looked at the girls, small, bruised, breathing in shallow gasps. Something shifted inside him like an old door, creaking open. Then I guess he'll have to come find us. The girls could walk barely. He lifted Asa and set her gently on the wagon bench. The others climbed in, leaning on each other for balance, dignity preserved through the simple act of helping one another. Naeli was last. She paused before climbing up, staring at Calder, as though trying to measure the kind of man he was. After a moment, she gave the smallest nod, a silent agreement that she would trust him for now. They rode out slow. The wagon wheels creaked like old bones. Dust rose in soft ribbons behind them. The sun climbed above the horizon, warming the frost, but not the ache in the air. The girls sat quietly, huddled beneath Calder's old ranch coat he wordlessly handed them. Asa curled into the warm fabric, as though it were a shelter, not just cloth. Kiona kept glancing over her shoulder, fearful of pursuit. Tallulah wiped blood from her forehead with trembling fingers. Zena breathed in short, shaky bursts. Naeli watched Calder from the corner of her eye. He didn't meet her gaze, but he sensed her scrutiny. She was trying to understand him. Why a man who looked weathered by his own ghosts would choose to interfere in something that would bring trouble to his doorstep. Calder found unexpected steadiness in the silence between them. For the first time in years, the weight he carried felt a little less crushing. They reached the edge of town, where wooden storefronts stood like old witnesses waiting to pass judgment. The wagon rolled slower here, tension thickening with every step of his horse. People stared. Whispers started. A mother pulled her child behind her skirt. A ranch hand spat in the dirt. Someone muttered, "Savages," under their breath. A few looked ashamed, glancing away as though their eyes might betray them. Others watched with dark satisfaction, waiting for the show to continue. Widow Marla rode beside the wagon, her chin lifted despite trembling hands. "Leave him be," she told a group of men gathered outside the saloon. "He's doing what none of you had the backbone to." Her words did little. Cowards seldom respond to truth. Kiona shrank back in the wagon, her fingers clutching the blanket. Naeli sat straighter, jaw set tight, refusing to let their hatred make her small. Calder kept his eyes forward. He did not hurry. He did not cower. He simply kept riding, his presence a quiet defiance that unsettled the crowd more than any weapon would have. Then the murmurs died. The street hushed. A horse's iron shoes clicked on the packed dirt behind them. Marshal Dent Caro rode into view. Caro was a large man, thick-necked, with a face carved into a permanent scowl. His badge glinted in the morning sun like it enjoyed being worn by him. He stopped his horse in the middle of the road, blocking their path entirely. "What you doing with my prisoners, Boone?" His voice was gravel dipped in arrogance. Calder stopped the wagon. "They ain't yours," Calder said quietly. Caro jaw ticked. "You letting yourself get soft? Ain't like you. People say you've been a ghost ever since your sister passed." Calder didn't rise to the bait. His voice stayed calm, low, almost tender in its steadiness. "Cut them down because they were dying. That's all. That's all," Caro repeated with a dark grin. "Well, that's enough to get you in a heap of trouble." Townsfolk gathered like dust drawn into a whirlwind. A few stepped back, more stepped closer. The girls froze, breath shallow, knowing this man's cruelty intimately. Caro leaned forward in his saddle, eyeing the girls. "Get him off that wagon. They're coming with me." "No," Calder said. The word landed like a hammer striking stone. Caro's hand drifted toward his holster. "You don't want this fight." Calder stepped down from the wagon, slow, deliberate. He stood between the marshal and the girls, not with bravado, but with the bone-deep certainty of a man who'd already made peace with consequences long ago. "I reckon," Calder said, voice soft as dust but firm as the horizon. "I already have it." Caro's fingers curled around his gun. The street held its breath. Naeli's eyes widened. Tallulah reached for her sister's hands. Widow Marla whispered a prayer. Calder stared straight into the marshal's dead-cold gaze. Caro's thumb flicked the strap off his holster. A moment stretched thin as wire, ready to snap, ready to spill blood, and everything went silent. The moment hung there, thin, breathless, strung tight as barbed wire in winter wind. Marshal Caro's gun hovered near the grip. Calder Boone stood still as a rooted stone. Behind him, the 5 Apache girls watched with the silent terror of those who knew exactly what this man was capable of. Townsfolk stood frozen, shame and curiosity mixing on their faces like two colors that refused to blend. Then, a sound cracked the tension. Not a gunshot, not a shout, just the distant slam of a saloon door. Caro paused, eyes flicking sideways, unhappy at losing his dramatic moment. He lowered his hand, but only slightly, just enough to give himself plausible civility. "We'll settle this later," he growled, voice heavy with threat. "But mark my words, Boone, you're making a mistake that'll cost you everything." Calder did not answer. Words would only feed the man's ego. Instead, he checked on the girls with a quiet glance, then urged his horse forward. The wagon rolled past the marshal. The girls' bodies stiffened as they passed him. Onassa hid her face beneath Calder's coat, trembling. Caro watched them leave with the hungry stare of a man who hated being denied. And the town? The town watched Calder Boone ride out with 5 injured girls, heads full of whispers they didn't say aloud. Their silence was its own confession. The world didn't right itself that morning, but it shifted just slightly on its axis. The ranch greeted them with a sorrowful peace, dry grass waving like tired hands, the wind brushing against the split-rail fence with a soft complaint. Calder helped the girls down one by one, steadying bruised legs and rubbing circulation back into cold fingers. He prepared beds in the barn loft, laying down blankets, straw, and whatever softness he could find. The girls moved slowly, each motion haunted by the echoes of ropes that had held them upside down for hours. Inside, he lit a lantern. Its warm circle of light wrapped the loft in gentle gold. Shadows danced along wooden beams like memories stretching their limbs. Onassa leaned her head against a beam, exhausted. Tallulah studied Calder with cautious curiosity. Zena drifted to a corner, curling into herself. Kiona paced a few steps, testing her legs. Naeli simply watched everything, taking the measure of the man who had inserted himself into their fate. Calder cooked on a small iron stove, beans and cornbread, simple food that filled the air with a homely warmth. He passed bowls without ceremony. The girls ate carefully, slowly, as though expecting the meal to be yanked away at any moment. Halfway through the food, Zena finally spoke, her voice barely a thread. "Why did you help us?" Calder paused, spoon in hand. He looked at the girls, not as strangers, not as burdens, but as living reminders of everything he once failed to protect. "Because he needed someone," he said simply. "No heroics, no sermon, just truth." Naeli's eyes softened, only a fraction, but it was the first shift in her walls. Healing is never a thunderclap. It starts in moments like that, small, invisible cracks letting in light. The days that followed moved in quiet beats, each one brushing against the next like pages of an old diary. Tallulah learned to walk steady again. Calder supported her elbow, without staring or hovering. He let her set the pace. Some days she accepted the help. Some days she refused with stubborn pride. Calder respected both choices. Onassa followed him everywhere, tiny steps padding behind him as he fed horses or fixed fences. She liked brushing the mare's mane with the gentleness of a child brushing her mother's hair. Calder never praised her aloud, but the way he handed her the comb each morning, without asking, was its own soft acknowledgement. Zena stayed quiet, but Calder made sure she always had the warmest spot near the lantern at night. He didn't comment on her silence. He understood it. Silence had been his companion for years, too. Kiona, once the jumpiest of the sisters, began laughing again. Small, startled laughs, usually at Calder's old mule, who dragged his feet with the eternal resentment of a creature born tired. And Naeli, she stood at the edges. She watched more than she spoke. She listened more than she asked. Her gaze often drifted to the horizon, as though searching for danger she knew would come. At night, Calder sometimes saw her awake long after the others were asleep, keeping vigil. One evening, while embers glowed in the stove and the wind tapped its cold fingers against the barn walls, Naeli approached him. "You're not like the others," she said quietly. Calder didn't know if she meant the townsfolk or white men in general. He didn't ask. She had given him enough trust already. She took a breath, a slow, painful one, and her voice trembled with the weight of memory. "We didn't steal anything. We were gathering medicine near the river. Men came, laughed, took us because they could." Her jaw clenched. "I tried to fight. I should have fought harder." Calder shook his head softly. Surviving is its own kind of courage. For the first time, Naeli looked like she might cry. But she didn't. She held her tears the way some people hold prayer, quietly, inwardly, sacred. Trust was no longer a stranger among them. It lived now in shared silence, in careful gestures, in the slow stitching of broken spirits. But trouble seldom respects healing. Word spread across town like wildfire in dry brush. Caro rallied men. Ranchers angry at Calder for defying authority. Drifters eager for violence. Cowards hiding their fear behind talk of law. Widow Marla did what she could, speaking truth wherever she found ears to listen. But towns evolve slower than mountains. Most preferred the comfort of ignorance. Days passed in uneasy peace until a night when the air felt too still, too expectant. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls. The wind carried a metallic smell, a warning nature gives to those willing to hear it. Naeli sensed it first. She rose from her bed of blankets, eyes narrowing. He's coming. The words had barely left her lips when hoofbeats thundered across the plain. Torches flared outside. Men shouted. And then, a boot slammed into the barn door, splitting it open. Marshal Caro stepped inside with 24 men behind him, firelight painting their faces in devilish orange. Stay where you are, Caro barked, pointing his gun up toward the loft. The girls scattered into the shadows, breaths sharp and frightened. Calder moved to the center of the barn, placing himself between them and the intruders. Caro sneered. Thought you could hide him? Thought the law wouldn't come knocking? Calder didn't flinch. You ain't the law. You're just a bully wearing a badge. A murmur rippled through the men behind Caro. Some shifted uncomfortably. Truth has a way of sliding under skin before a man realizes it. Caro ignored it. They're thieves. They're liars. They're property of the government. And I aim to drag him back myself. Calder kept his voice calm, level, the way a man speaks when he knows fear only feeds wolves. You ain't talking them. Caro signaled 2 men to seize him. They grabbed Calder by the arms, dragging him toward the door. The girls watched in horror, eyes wide, bodies frozen like prey awaiting the strike. Then, a rustle, a slip, a single misstep. Tallulah, trying to shift deeper into the shadows of the loft, knocked over a small bucket. It hit the floor with a clang. Caro's grin slowly spread. There they are. He shoved past his men, climbing the ladder with a predator's satisfaction. Naeli stepped out of the shadows, placing herself between him and her sisters. She trembled, but she stood her ground. We are not going with you. Caro raised his gun. Wrong answer. But before he could pull the trigger, stop! A woman's voice cracked through the barn like lightning. Widow Marla stood in the doorway, lantern in hand, face fierce with moral fury. And behind her, townsfolk, dozens of them, men who'd felt shame, women who'd whispered doubts, people who'd turned away once and regretted it ever since. Marla pointed at Caro. Tell them the truth. Tell them what you did. These girls were never thieves. You hung them because they were vulnerable, because you enjoy cruelty. Caro barked a laugh, but it sounded unsteady. You got no proof, woman. A rancher stepped forward. We got her word, and we got our own eyes. Saw the bruises. Saw the ropes. More murmurs. More shifting feet. Caro realized his grip on the town was slipping like sand through greedy fingers. He snapped. He whirled toward Naeli, fingers squeezing the trigger. But Calder broke free of the men, restraining him, and lunged. He tackled Caro just as the shot fired. The bullet struck a beam instead of a body. Chaos erupted. Caro scrambled to his feet, gun raised again. But one of the townsfolk, a rancher with trembling hands, fired first. Caro jerked backward, shock carving itself across his face before he hit the barn floor with a thud that echoed like the closing of a chapter long overdue. Silence followed. Heavy, breathless, final. The girls emerged one by one, staring down at the fallen marshal. He looked small now, powerless, a man without the cruelty that once enlarged him. Apologies came next, awkward, stammered, imperfect, from the townsfolk who had watched and done nothing. Naeli accepted them with quiet dignity, not for their sake, but for her sisters. Calder didn't ask the girls to stay. He simply said, "You're safe now." But safety is rarely the end of a story. Healing takes roots. Belonging takes time. The girls chose to remain at the ranch for a while, long enough to regain their strength, long enough to feel soil beneath their feet without fear, long enough to let their spirits rise again like dawn after a long night. One evening, as Calder fed the horses, Naeli approached him with something small wrapped in cloth. She handed it to him without speaking. Inside was a hand-carved wooden bird, wings stretched wide, ready for sky. "For freeing us," she said softly. "Not just from the ropes." Calder held the carving gently, as if it were something breakable. "You did that yourselves," he replied. Naeli smiled, barely but beautifully. Then she walked back toward her sisters, who laughed around a small fire, their voices soft but rising. Calder looked at the bird again. Freedom carved into wood. Hope shaped by hands once bound. The world felt a little less heavy. And now, to you, the one listening to this story across the miles of time. Sometimes mercy comes late. Sometimes it comes quiet. And sometimes it arrives in the shape of a stranger who doesn't ask for thanks. If ever you find someone hanging by the last thread of their hope, remember this. It doesn't take a hero to save a life. Just a steady hand, a braver heart than yesterday, and the courage to say, "You're safe now."